I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I'm here, hopefully, with my wonderful co-host,
Rebecca Wood.
Yay! Yes, it was a little more technical show than usual. We're not in studio today. I'm actually up in Michigan, up near Traverse City, actually, and Rebecca, of course, is back home. We're all doing the technical thing, and we got an interesting show lined up for you today. We're going to switch up our order a little bit. Usually, I like to chat for about 15 minutes or so with you folks. But today we have a special guest. He's calling in all the way from Latvia, Dr. Christopher Busby. So he's already on the line, so we're going to go to him in just a minute. And then we'll chat for a little bit. And then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to hear from our wonderful advertisers and patrons. And then Rebecca is going to be talking to us about what exactly are you going to be talking to us about, Rebecca?
Corsican Hares this time. I'm still on this hare kick.
Corsican Hares. Okay, Hares, right? You're talking the little mammals, right? Okay, all right, good.
Not
okay.
the hair of people or animals on Corsica, no.
Okay, all right. And then we have a whole bunch of ecological news stories to get to. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now, and hopefully at some point during this show we're going to hear from you, since this is a call-in show. You can call it at any time in this hour at 877-909-1007. That's 877-909-1007. Or you can send us a text at 419-973-5841, and we'll be happy to read your text on the air. And like I say, I'm up in the Upper Peninsula, or not the Upper Peninsula. I'm up near the bridge. I'm near the bridge over to the Upper Peninsula there in Traverse City. Oh, yes. Okay, yes. I'm at the tip of the thumb in Michigan, as they say. And it's an area I've gone to most of my life as for vacations, for summer, for camping, and lots of people do. And I just wanted to mention that, on the way up here, and earlier in the week, I had to actually drive a truck to Pennsylvania. I had to make a delivery of huge ceramic blocks over to Butler, Pennsylvania. And basically everywhere I'm seeing that I'm driving, I'm seeing they're doing tons and tons of cutting down the trees alongside the roads. And I can't help but wonder if this might not be part of the whole Build Back Better, because they said they were going to put all these billions of dollars into infrastructure. And, oftentimes that translates into just giving people money so they can cut down trees real quick, because it shows you've done something. And it seems to be like this is when we should be encouraging trees alongside roads to be growing, but it seems to be a nationwide pattern. I was talking to somebody in Wisconsin. They're doing the same thing along federal highways there. How about you? How about where you are? Have you taken a drive lately and seen them cutting down trees that have it's kind of sad because some of these trees I sort of have been watching grow for 20, 30 years. I saw them when they first got started, and now they're 30, 50 years old. Kind of like me, I'll be turned 60 in a couple weeks here. And now, all of a sudden, one weekend, and they're gone. It's kind of sad. Have you seen this? Give us a call at 877-909-1007. Just wanted to mention that before we get into the show proper, and I think let's go to our guest. We're going to talk to Dr. Chris Busby. Hello, Dr. Busby. Are you with us?
Yes. Hello.
All right, Josh. How's that on the sound level? Is that good?
Well, it's I can hear you quite well. I can. If you can hear me well, we're fine.
Yep. I just cranked up the volume at this end, so I think we're good now.
Do you want? I can say something if you like, and you can sort of check the volume while I'm talking. Do you want, or are you okay with this?
We just did, and we're good now. Right. So thank you. Okay, Dr. Busby, let's start with your name and who you're with.
I'm Dr. Chris Busby. I was a visiting professor at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and I've been associated with quite a few universities, most of whom have kicked me out at one point or another. I'm 76 years old now, and I've escaped from England after Brexit to go and live in Latvia, where I live in the middle of a forest and write scientific papers and do research into various things, including the health effects of ionizing radiation.
That's great. So you have a bit more freedom than some researchers who might be a little bit limited by what their sort of the official line that their universities take on controversial topics.
Well, this has been my situation, for all of the time I've been doing this research since about 1990. I started to walk into this area of the health effects of radioactive pollution, I guess you would call it, all these substances which are released from nuclear power stations and released from nuclear weapons tests in the 1960s and generally now contaminate most of the environment. And I became interested in what their effects might be on living systems. So since 1990, I've been studying all that stuff. But I've been very happily able to deal with it independent of universities, because if you are in a university or if you're working for somebody, then they can control what it is you look at, they can control what it is that you're publishing, and they can generally put pressure on you, serious economic pressure, like say you can't get any money and you can't pay the mortgage and all the rest of it. So they do this, and that's resulted in a situation where the appreciation of the health effects of these substances have basically been covered up. So I've spent 30 years on this, but I've done it with little money. I've done it because I thought that it was important, and I've sort of lived outside the system. So after in England about 3 or 4 years ago, it started to get a bit hot for me because I was carrying out court cases for nuclear test veterans, and in one case for a submariner on a nuclear submarine. I thought it was getting a bit hot, so I ran away to Latvia, and now I live in the forest and do my research from the Latvian forest. Although God knows what's going to happen, because now we've got all this problem with Ukraine and Russia and all the rest of it. So maybe I've walked from the frying pan into the fire.
Well, I think that is one of the lessons we've learned about nuclear pollution, is there really is no over there. It's given that, the effects of disasters affect the whole globe. So, but let's get specific here, because the reason I invited you on is I saw an article that was published this past April about where you were discussing the linear no threshold model, and we've talked about that model on this show before. Basically, it's the good thing about it is it says that there's no threshold below which there's no damage from radiation. In other words, even the smallest additional dose of radiation causes additional cancers and other health effects. But your paper, and that has been under attack, especially the last few years of the Trump administration. They were trying to throw out the linear no threshold model and actually argue that radiation exposure is good for you. And thankfully that has been headed off. But a lot of environmental activists in the U.S. have spent a lot of time defending the linear no threshold model from attacks by the nuclear industry that want to say that's much too restrictive. But this article that you published suggests that the linear no threshold model is actually way underestimating the amounts of health effects and the amount of damage. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's a fair assessment. The underpinning of the linear no threshold model, the model was developed in between 1955 and 1975, very roughly. And it took a very simplistic approach to the effects of radiation. It said that radiation is something that you can just measure with a Geiger counter, or you can measure it on the basis of the energy released from the decay of internal radionuclides. These are all the same things according to the model. And so everything can be lumped into one sort of bag, which is energy. And the model says that energy divided by the amount of mass that the energy is dissipated in gives you this quantity called absorbed dose. And everybody talks about dose. So when someone says, hey, look, all these people are dying of cancer near Rocky Flats, then the nuclear industry come along and say, yes, but that's impossible that could be caused by Rocky Flats contamination because the dose is too low. So right from the very beginning, in 1990, I started looking at this argument about dose and very quickly realized that it was bogus, that the whole concept of measuring radiation through absorbed dose was useless when considering internal radionuclides like uranium-238, uranium-235, plutonium-239, strontium-90, all this crap that gets released by these nuclear sites and also by the nuclear weapons testing in the 1960s when these models were developed. And of course, it quickly turned out when you look at all of the data, you look at all the reports that the various risk agencies wrote, that it was inevitable that they had to find some way to cover all of this stuff up because people were dying, children were dying, there was an increase in infant mortality, and about 20 years later there was an increase in cancer, which is essentially the cancer epidemic that everybody knows about. In 1950s to 1960s, probably about 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 people got cancer, but now it's like 1 in 2 people got cancer. Something's going on there that causes cancer.
So now, when you talk about 20 years later, you're talking about 20 years after the atmospheric nuclear tests that exposed literally everyone on the globe to additional radiation.
That's right. That's the largest injection of radioactivity into the planet. I mean, it's much more than Chernobyl, it's much more than Fukushima. Of course, if you live close to Chernobyl, it's not much more, but in terms of global exposure, all of those bombs that they blew up between 1952 and then when it was stopped in 1963, although the French and the Chinese still blew up a few bombs, but most of the radioactivity came down between 1959 and 63. It got into the food chain, it got into the milk, and it caused a significant increase in infant deaths, in children dying from congenital malformations. And 20 years later, roughly, the cancer epidemic began. And now we live with a situation where 1 in 2 people die of cancer. And it's quite clear that the cause of that was the injection into the planetary atmosphere, all of this stuff. But the big change that occurred was when I realized, and a few other people realized, but I published this paper last year, in 2021, that the basis for the risk model, which is the lifespan study of the Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was dishonestly manipulated, and you can show this quite clearly from data which is available if you bother to dig for it. And the fact is that most of the cancers that came about as a result of the Hiroshima bomb came about because people were exposed to uranium-234, and uranium-235, but mainly uranium-234, which came down in the black rain, the Hiroshima black rain. Now, around about the same time as my paper was published, July 2021, the Japanese government had a court case in which they were looking at what they call the hibakushas. These are the survivors of the bombing, who were nowhere near the bomb. They were people living like 3, 4, 5, 6 kilometers away, and they were exposed to the uranium in the black rain, but they were not. But their dose, and this is the point about dose, their dose from the bomb itself was 0. But these were the people who were getting the cancer. And so that was my paper that I published in 2021, which was the first breakthrough. And this new paper that you're talking about now, which was published in April, basically looks at the entire situation of people being exposed to these radionuclides. And if the lifespan study was wrong, we have to then go to epidemiology to see what's happening. And what we see is that people are dying of cancer because of the weapons fallout, and that's a genetic damage that's gone into every single system, but certainly the human race, and into the children and into the grandchildren. Because I've also studied those people. I've studied the grandchildren and the children of the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, and we found a 10-fold and a 9-fold, respectively, increase in congenital malformations in the children and grandchildren.
So the damage that gets caused essentially sort of accumulates, is what you're saying.
Sorry, it's a what?
The damage, the genetic damage from the initial radiation releases accumulates in.
Yes, no, that's right. No, that is a signal that's gone into the DNA of the human race, and it's going to be expressed over the rest of the lifetime of the human race. So if, you can get cancer, your child can get cancer or get congenital malformation, and their child can get cancer or congenital malformation, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, we've done studies in Chernobyl of mice, what they call bank voles. Essentially, you can say they're mice. And you can actually measure the genetic damage in the mini satellite mutation rates. You can measure that with using this DNA test that people use. And what you find is that 22 generations of mice express radiation damage. So that stuff is with the human race. I mean, I talked about this. I did a study of Fallujah, where the United States were using uranium weapons in Iraq in 2003. And they're still experiencing a very high level of infant mortality due to heart defects and kidney damage and, hydrocephalus and all that stuff. Even now, although, these are grandchildren now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be depleted uranium, where they take quote-unquote depleted uranium, where they use it to not as a nuclear weapon, but as the casings around artillery shells and things of that nature.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go.
I went out there. I went to Iraq with a scintillation counter, and I saw this stuff. They were shooting it all over the place, and it's radioactive, and it's very bad. And the problem with uranium, people think uranium's okay because it's sort of somehow natural, but it's not natural when you dig it out of the ground and concentrate it into a metal and then shoot it at somebody. That's not natural. That's never existed throughout evolution. And that uranium gets into the body, and then it binds to DNA. There's a very high affinity, chemical affinity, between uranium and DNA. And DNA is now well accepted to be the target. And I say this in this paper, the new one. That's the target for radiation effects is the DNA. Well, it's obvious, really. Anybody can see that that's the case. And it was said originally by the Nobel Prize winner Hermann Muller in 1952, when it was first discovered.
So let's focus on your paper here, the most recent one that we're talking about. So the linear no threshold model, as you say in your paper, gives you this nice straight line that starts, if you graph it, it starts at 0, 0, and it's just a straight line up. As you get more dose, you get more cancer mortalities. But your paper has a much more complicated curve to it, and that's not a straight line. And it doesn't start at 0, 0, does it? It starts much higher up on the graph.
That's right. It starts at in the case of the Hiroshima. If we take the Hiroshima survivors, it starts at the background level caused by the black rain. And in fact, we know this is the case because some Japanese epidemiologists in 2008, a chap called Wanatabe, they decided to use a different control group. And when you do epidemiology, essentially what you do is you look at people who are exposed and you compare them to people who are not exposed. I mean, that's the basic epidemiology. So you go to a Chinese restaurant, everybody gets ill, and you look to see what the rate of illness in those people who went to the Chinese restaurant are compared to the people who didn't go to the Chinese restaurant. And what happened with Hiroshima is that they had a control group who were not there at the time of the bomb. So this is called the not-in-city control group. But in 1973, when they discovered by using that control group that lots more people got cancer than they thought ought to, they threw out the control group, and then they just drew a straight line through the high dose, medium dose, and low dose people. And that's where we get the coefficients for cancer in terms of dose. And that's what the risk model is that if you have this sort of dose, you'll get that level of cancer. Okay. But the point is that's wrong because there's this line, the dotted line in my graph, the red dotted line in my graph, which shows the background dose due to the uranium-234 that fell down with the black rain. But the other thing about it is that like you say, the dose response that I've written into the paper is a bit strange looking at it, because it goes right up very sharply at a very low dose, then it comes right down again, and then it goes up more gradually. And there are two reasons for that. But the main reason for that, the most important reason for that strange-looking graph, is that cells are much more sensitive to radiation when they're replicating. So as you live through your life, from time to time, your cells get old and, they can't function very well anymore. And so what they do is they kill themselves and before they replicate, in order to produce another cell to replace the one that is dead. And so when they do that, because they have to do all sorts of important, interesting and weird things, they have to get the DNA together and they have to splice it together and they have to split into two cells and all that really complicated architecture. They're much more sensitive to radiation. And in your body at any one time, you have all these different cells. You have stomach cells and epithelial lining cells of the colon, and you have lung cells, you have blood cells, all these. And when they get damaged, as you age, what they do is they replace themselves by splitting. And at the point that they split, they are very much more sensitive to radiation damage. So if you take an individual and you shoot a small amount of radiation at them, these are the cells that will start to get mutated, and then they will be killed. Of course, once they're killed, they won't be able to produce cancer because they're dead. But if the radiation dose that they get, the very small radiation dose that they get, is enough to cause them to mutate, then they will mutate, and then you'll get 2 dodgy cells, and then you'll get 4, and then you'll get 8, and then you'll get 16, and so on. That's called the clone. That's the damaged clone, and you'll get clonal expansion, which is exponential. And that's why cancer goes up exponentially with age. Most cancers go up exponentially with age. So in other words, you don't get it when you're 20, but you increasingly get it when you're 35, and you're more likely to get it when you're 50. And by the time you get 60 or 70, you've got quite a high number of these damaged clone cells, and they're more likely to go on to become cancerous. That's how it works. Anyway, the point about this is that if in the low dose region, when you have very small doses, you get a very high chance of mutation. And then then when the dose gets a little bit higher, then you kill the cells that are replicating, and so then it will go down. And then you start to affect the cells which are not replicating, which are much less sensitive, and so your cancer goes up more gradually. So that's where you get that up and down and going up again. And of course, when you get too much radiation, it just kills the person. So then the cancer rate comes down again. So you've got basically 2 regions in the cancer induction by radiation. You've got the low dose region and the high dose region, and the mechanism is different.
Right. So your complicated graph, and I keep trying to figure, an analogy, something like a picture that this sort of draws, but it shows an almost straight up line, as you say, exponential, up to a point, and then it drops down, and then it goes back up again. But this shows that at the low doses, at least the linear no threshold model is underestimating cancers by, I think you say in the paper, 3 orders of magnitude.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I mean, all the evidence shows that. But the reason that nobody has done anything about it is because that number seems so enormous that anybody advancing such a theory has to be mad. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is that, of course, the people who regulate radiation, they are people who are paid by the people who want to continue to have nuclear power and to have nuclear submarines and nuclear ships and nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. I mean, that's an enormously powerful lobby in terms of economics. It's a huge economics lobby. I mean, you're talking about what we used to call the nuclear military complex, and they really don't want to have anybody coming along and saying, look, excuse me, you're killing everybody.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating, Dr. Busby, and unfortunately we only have an hour show. We've got to move on in a minute or so here, but I just want to say I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and say that you don't have to be mad, but you do have to be somewhat independent of your
Well, yes, that's right. That's right, Joe. That's right. You know, but anyway, this will effectively be what we call in science a paradigm change. You know, whether or not the governments will do anything about it is something else, because the amount of energy and money behind it all is something else. But people have to realise when they make a decision about whether to have nuclear or not have nuclear for whatever reason, that the story behind it, that it's actually quite safe, is bogus.
Yeah, and I think the most important takeaway is that your study gives a mechanism, and it supports the epidemiological studies that have followed these radiation releases that showed, you know, the studies of actual numbers of people who got sick that showed much higher incidences of cancer than were predicted by the linear no threshold. And so I think it's an important study. And so thanks for coming on and talking to us about it.
That's okay. You're welcome. Okay.
All right. Well, have a good day. And
yeah.
I hope it's nice weather there in Latvia. So.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
Cheers.
All right. That was Dr. Chris Busby. And his departure opens the line. And, of course, if anyone wants to comment on that or any environmental issue, just give us a call at 877-909-1007. And now we're going to move on to hear from our wonderful, wonderful sponsors and patrons. For Green Futures brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy, from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them, find out what's going on. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, which is a very nice website at wcparks.org. And, of course, they have a nifty app that I always like to talk about, which is go to any app store and just search for WC Parks. And they're on all the social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., etc., etc. That's the Wood County Park District. And For Green Futures also brought to you by our wonderful patrons. And our patrons are people that have realized that if they want to get some of this information that you're literally not going to hear anywhere else, they need to make a little bit of investment in that. And every month, a little bit comes out of their checking account, comes over to us, and that's how we can keep the show on the air. And the way they set that up was by going to patreon.com. That's Patreon. They searched for a Green Future there, and up popped our little Patreon page. They picked the monthly amount that they can afford. You know, we don't want people to suffer. Although if you're willing to suffer to help support this program, we're not going to discourage that either. But and then they just signed up, and every month, painlessly, a little comes out of their account and comes over to us. And that's how we can afford to bring you For a Green Future every week. All right. And every week, we also hear from Rebecca. Rebecca, how are you doing?
Not bad. How about you?
Good. What did you think of Dr. Busby there?
I actually was not aware that the children and grandchildren of Hiroshima's survivors also have elevated cancer rates, or that it was cumulative. I mean, I guess that stands to reason, but I thought maybe it would peter out after a couple generations, you know?
Well, some of it might peter out after like hundreds of generations, but
so far not. I'm hearing.
I mean, once you put a genetic mistake into a population, unless that mistake is very strongly selected against, it will just persist along with all the, because you get about 1 million genes in a human, and it only takes one to create a birth defect like cleft palate, for example. And so if you reproduce and you've got 999,999 good genes and that one bad one, that person will manage to be born, and they'll try to reproduce like every like every organism tries to reproduce, and so that one bad gene gets carried along with the 1 million other good genes, and so it takes a long time. And some like some things like cleft palate, some birth defects, there's a whole bunch of genetic diseases that we know about that have been with us as long as there have been humans. So now a lot of them get selected against, because it reduces your ability to reproduce. But as long as it doesn't eliminate your ability to reproduce, it'll get carried along with the rest of the good genes for many, many generations. So, okay, and on that cheery note, let's hear your report. What will you be talking to us about this week, Rebecca?
Alrighty. Well, today is May Day. It's the holiday of May Day, and one of the important roots of May Day is apparently the Floralia, which the Romans used to hold in the honor of the goddess Flora, who's the goddess of flowers, and sort of spring by extension. Because spring is when you get a lot of flowers all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So yeah, and as part of this, one of the traditions of the Romans was to release a bunch of hares and goats, and probably in southern and central Italy, the type that they released was probably the Corsican hare, the subject of my short segment today. Yeah, the Corsican hare, Latin name is Lepus corsicanus. It's from the family Leporidae, also called the Apennine hare. It's native to it's not actually native to Corsica. It was brought there in the 1600s, apparently, but it lives in Corsica in southern and central Italy primarily, and it was originally described in 1898 by William Edward de Winter, and really, like, the major interesting thing about the Corsican hare is how much like all the other hares it looks. And the trouble this has caused with scientists, because good old William Edward de Winter thought it was a separate species, and then for decades later people thought it was a subspecies of European or Cape hare. But then they came out with DNA evidence, and surprise, no, it is not. And it doesn't interbreed with European hares to speak of. So they think this happened because of the Ice Age. The last Ice Age kind of elevated populations of this particular hare until it couldn't interbreed with other species anymore. They also thought there was hybridization going on with European hares, but no. The actual hybridization was going on between European and Grenadian hares on the island of Corsica. So...
But those aren't the Corsican hares.
No, completely different hares. Only don't let the fact that they're... Can you imagine being rejected because somebody's like, ooh, gross, your ears are 1 millimeter too long, and that patch of hair on your shoulders is actually more kind of reddish brown than grayish brown? Ick. Go away, loser. That seems awfully picky. Just seems kind of, so it's a subspecies. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but sexual selection is a thing. I mean, the preferences of females in particular do drive how things end up lots of times. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I can imagine it.
Very true. But yeah, it has dark markings on its throat. I believe I learned a couple new words. I learned the word pelage, which pelage means hair or fur. So somebody was like, "Oh, it has dark pelage," and I'm like, "Just say fur."
How's that spelled?
Pelage, I think.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, it's differentiated by that. Has black hair on its neck and back. The rest of it is more or less brown with a cream-colored belly. It has red-gray fur on its hips and shoulders, and it's different because they're from the European hare because its under fur has which is still sort of white or cream-colored, has more of a gray base as opposed to white. Alrighty then.
So that's enough to turn
amazingly
off your
similar
average
visually,
hair. Right, okay.
but it's also slightly smaller. So amazingly similar visually to the point where they really can't. There's been a lot of trouble with enforcing anti-poaching legislation because it's like, so I didn't know. How am I supposed to? I didn't have a millimeter measurer on my gun. I couldn't tell its ears were too smaller. Sorry, I'm colorblind. So it's legitimately difficult. Also it has 4 toes in the back, 5 in front on its front feet, and another new word. Its skull is fenestrated, which means that it has a lot of small perforations or transparent areas. Now, I don't really understand this because, most animals have holes in their skulls for their eyes and ears and nose and mouth and so forth, so I guess this one has more. It has more little tiny perforations or transparent areas. Apparently. So, now we know. Then
that was fenestrations?
Fenestration, which is as opposed to animals with non-fenestrated skulls.
Okay, I actually did know that word because...
okay, well, good for you. Yeah. Its habitat is...
It's like the French word fenestra, which means window. So it's like having lots of little windows.
Oh, yeah, if you're defenestrated, I believe that means somebody pushed you out of a window.
Something like that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But okay, a habitat, it likes to live in key grassland, farm fields, dunes, cities, and deciduous woods, so a lot of different places. In Sicily, it lives from sea level to 2,400 meters up Mount Etna. And in the Apennines, it lives as far as 1,900 meters up. It's endangered because of habitat loss, hunting, competition with European rabbits and hares, and so that's basically the Corsican hare. It looks like other hares, but it's not.
All right. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for that.
You're
report.
welcome.
So now on to ecological news. So I wanted to start off with there's a story in Politico, which basically kind of set me to almost panicking. I've calmed down since then, but this story, the headline is, Last Chance, Greens Push Climate Compromise with Manchin. And first of all, I'm a Green. And no, Greens are not pushing any kind of climate compromise with Senator Joe Manchin. This is a story that ran on April 24th. It's by Josh Siegel and Zach Coleman. And essentially what this story is saying is that a lot of the biggest, wealthiest environmental groups, like the Environmental Defense Fund, for example, the ones with the big fundraising arms that send you the big envelopes full of stuff, that they're getting ready to cut a deal with Joe Manchin on energy, and that this deal, essentially what it would do is use taxpayer dollars to subsidize coal, oil, and gas, and nuclear, and then also toss a little bit over to wind and solar. But mainly what they want to do is give Joe Manchin everything he wants in order to be able to say that they got something. And
he'll stop being angry about not getting his own way. That's why it's a compromise.
Right, but of course we know that doesn't actually work. Once you give
him everything he wants, and he won't be annoyed anymore. Yay! Everyone wins.
Beautiful theory, except of course, once you give somebody like that everything they want, then suddenly they figure out more things to want. So there's no end.
Yeah,
to giving
that's a
people
problem.
like that everything they want because they keep wanting more. Essentially, I wanted to talk about this because this was the same push, the same exact thing that happened with Obamacare back in the Obama administration and health insurance. Because at the beginning, those of us that helped elect Obama because we thought we were going to get universal single-payer health care, we were all enthusiastic and excited. We didn't know that in November of 2020, after getting elected, Obama went and made a deal with the health insurance companies
great.
And he went to them and said, okay, let's work out what Obamacare is. And what Obamacare ended up being is, of course, taxpayers subsidizing high insurance premium, infinitely high insurance premiums, no caps or anything like that. And not even the public option. But what happened is after a year of pushing this, the Democrats were like, we've got to get something. So they gave us Obamacare, the ACA, which is why right now people are paying health insurance premiums that are larger than their mortgages. Millions of households are they're going bankrupt and losing their homes. Millions of Americans are not getting any health insurance because they can't afford that first visit to the doctor, so they don't go until they're terminal. Literally, it's like the worst healthcare system you can cobble together that will still make a whole bunch of people really wealthy, and that is the health insurance executives and investors. So this idea that we've got to get something and we need to is absolutely wrong, especially in this case, because what is happening right now in the United States of America and all over the world is that wind power and solar power have gotten so cheap that they are replacing all the other sources. The coal plants are shutting down. Even natural gas plants now are shutting down because wind and solar have dropped below the cost of fracked natural gas. And so 90+% of new electrical generation in this country is either wind or solar, which is great. So what's happening is the market forces literally are pushing us in the direction we need to go, which is why now all of a sudden Joe Manchin, who owns a gigantic coal plant, wants to have a quote-unquote compromise that subsidizes coal and nuclear and natural gas. And so to just get something, one of the League of Conservation Voters guys is quoted in this article saying, this is it, this is our shot, we've got to get it done. In this case, getting what Joe Manchin wants done is literally worse than doing nothing. Because right now, doing nothing is replacing coal and nuclear and gas with wind and solar. So, it would be nice if the government were to do something that would accelerate us in that direction even faster, but that's not what.
Or at least stop slowing us down. Oh, right. Lord.
This quote unquote compromise is a bill, it's just designed to slow down the transition and keep us hooked on the dirty sources for another decade or two. The same way we've been hooked on horribly expensive healthcare premiums for over a decade now. So I wanted to get that one out of the way. And then that ties in with my next story, because as I was driving up here to Michigan on Friday, I happened to catch on C-SPAN, there was a hearing of the Energy Secretary Granholm in front of the House Energy Subcommittee. And that was I heard this on Friday. It was at like 11 in the morning on C-SPAN. And for 2 plus hours, I was listening as House of Representative after House Rep were grilling her. And almost all of it was like, you're in favor of nuclear, right? And she was like, yes, I love nuclear. And you're in favor of expanding natural gas and oil exploration, right? And she's like, yes, we've approved all the permits. We've approved every pipeline application. We are working as hard as we can to get more oil out of the ground and more gas. And, what we were promised when Biden was running, which is a transition over to wind and solar, has really been just tossed by the wayside here. And the Republicans especially kept praising her. They kept saying, I'm so glad to hear that you're so strongly in favor of nuclear, and I'm so glad to hear you're supporting more pipelines and more oil and gas. If the Republicans are agreeing with you so strongly, it's probably you have the wrong position when it comes to things like environment and energy policy. Because as we know, here in Ohio, whose energy policy was dictated by First Energy, the Republicans do not know what they're doing. Well, they're doing the worst possible thing. And some of the stuff that some of these Republican representatives were saying was just ridiculous. Like one guy said that he was told by the head of General Electric that if we switched to wind and solar, the electric grid would collapse, which is absolutely ridiculous. It's been disproven 1,000 times. And, right now we are at levels of wind and solar that the utilities were saying 10 years ago would cause the grid to collapse and be unbalanced and unsustainable. And in fact, what we found is the opposite, that the more wind and solar, the more dependable the grid is getting. And of course, there's places like Scotland that get 100% of their electricity from wind. There's places like Australia, which is an extremely stable grid that has never had a nuclear plant in Australia. So it's just a lie, but again, in the context of this hearing, they were allowed to just repeat all the old talking points that have been disproven over the past 20 years as if, the last 20 years hadn't happened. So one thing they talked about was there was a gal from California, Doris Matsui, represented from Sacramento, and there's a shut down nuclear plant in Sacramento that has a bunch of radioactive waste in it that they're holding on to, spent fuel rods that could melt down and explode. And it is in a precarious position. It's right next to the ocean. It could get flooded, which could cause a nuclear disaster. But her solution is a nationwide interim fuel storage place, which is absolutely unacceptable, as we know from having talked to our friend Diane Drigo at NEARS, that would expose millions of Americans to high doses of radiation, and we cannot have that. So it was a really disappointing, very disappointing hearing, and I kind of had trouble telling the difference between, if she was part of a Republican or a Democrat administration. So let's hope that story we heard about earlier is wrong, and shame on Secretary Granholm. Bad job there in that interview. Okay, we are rushing right along. We got about 10 minutes left of the show. An interesting story. The New Yorker on the 30th of April released a story and a little mini documentary talking about, the title is American Scar, and it's talking about Trump's wall, which, politically and in terms of practical terms, what it was supposed to do, which is keep immigrants from crossing the border into America, is a complete failure. Because, as they showed in this documentary, literally 3 minutes with a battery-powered Sawzall, and you're through the wall. So, all this billions and billions of dollars, it was completely wasted in terms of the thing that this wall is supposed to do. It literally, physically does not do the job. But B, the amount of environmental damage that this wall has already done is just incredible. And this documentary that was released by the New Yorker is just heartbreaking, because all kinds of animals are trying to do the migrations that they've done for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and they cannot. They are now stopped by this wall, which was exempted from all environmental regulation because it was authorized under the Defense Department Act during a quote-unquote emergency. And as I said, so we're destroying the ecosystems down there without even slowing any kind of cross-border migrations. And so I urge everybody to take a look at this. The title is The Ecological Destruction from the Border Wall and, quote, American Scar, unquote. And it was released April 30th, and that's with the New Yorker. So just a reminder that these bad environmental decisions don't just go away once administrations change. You have to actually try to repair the damage that gets done, or the damage is just going to continue, which is what's been happening. Okay, switch that over to some a little more upbeat news. There is a problem in a lot of places with birds that get into places and situations that are not good for them. And there's a story in Euronews.green, and the title is How Scary Birds Are Flying to the Rescue of Endangered Species. And essentially what they found is it's a very simple solution. You create this huge kite that's shaped like a predatory bird, and you fly it over the area that's dangerous for birds, and they'll avoid that area because no one wants to mess with a 15-foot wingspan raptor, which is what these scary bird kites look like. And I'm thinking they probably would help with, even though wind turbine bird strikes are not a big thing, it's only one bird per turbine per year, but even that might be reduced by just putting up some of these scary bird kites. And the article's talking about how they're being used to great effect off the coast of Portugal, because what they do is now fishermen fly these kites along their fishing lines that they drag behind them in the ocean. And now the birds, which had been diving in and getting caught on the hooks and get tangled in the nets, they don't do that anymore because the scary birds effectively keep them off. So it's a nice, simple, cheap, effective technique for reducing bird kills, and I just thought it's nice to report on things that work. And so that's a nice little article. Another interesting article. They've done studies. This is in Science News back on April 25th. They've done some studies of some of the places where they had these tremendous mega fires, like in California. And the theory, they thought that maybe what was happening is the soil was essentially getting sterilized by these incredibly hot, huge fires. But instead, what they're finding, about 70% of the species of bacteria and fungi and microbes and stuff that live in the soil do get killed in the megafires, but 30% actually survive. And they immediately start decomposing the burned wood and stuff. And so soil microbes, basically the thrust of this article, which is this is a story in Science News on April 25th. It's Meet the Forest Microbes That Can Survive Megafires. And basically the thrust is that the microbes are much tougher than any of the researchers expected. And a whole bunch of them, like actinobacteria and basidio yeast and even penicillin, survive the fires. Their spores are strong enough to not get burnt up, and they immediately start breaking stuff down and trying to heal the forest. So nice little story about microbial resiliency. Okay, we're fast running out of time, although we definitely have time to read a text if anyone would like to share one. Little update from Fairy Creek, which is what we've been following this story for over a year now. Over in British Columbia on Victoria Island, they're trying to cut down the last of the old-growth forest. Premier Horgan, Premier of British Columbia, roughly equivalent to a governor in the United States, gave a speech back on April 29th basically saying full steam ahead on cutting down all the old growth. He was giving it to a bunch of loggers, logging company executives, and he was saying, basically he was accusing the protesters of who are like literally putting their lives on the line to protect the last of the old growth. They're calling them names, and he's saying they're holier than thou, and not a good look for Premier Horgan there.
Darn near everybody's holier than him. What you gonna do?
That's a point.
Yeah.
He was probably talking to a room full of the least holy people on the planet.
Right.
Actually, so I hadn't even thought about that. Okay, one other thing is they're starting to sentence the Ferry Creek protesters that we were talked about, and some of whom we interviewed from last year. They gave this one first-time protester 7 days in jail, which doesn't sound like much to us Americans, but to Canadians, that's like, wow, that is incredibly harsh. And they're saying basically because he shouldn't be trying to protect the last of the old growth. So not a good thing from the Canadian courts. All right, well, we've reached the end of the show. Gosh, all right, thanks so much. This is Joe DeMare.
And Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off.
We need to make this country